Hello, my name is Joshua, as you well know, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. And of course, today we are looking a little bit at reacting to the video that you will see alongside this broadcast, which is one by Dr. Hania Zlotnik. And now Hania is a population specialist and has done a lot of work at the UN. And the reason that we have Hania speak to us a little bit about this issue is, I think, because when she watched the first version of the MOOC, she said she enjoyed it, so thank you for that, Hania. But she said there were aspects there on the discussion on reproductive rights that she wanted to speak about, and I thought it would be a good idea if we got her views. And so Sarah and I agreed that we'd have Hania speak, and I think what you have from Hania there is a history of how some of these elements around population developed and reproductive rights, and something of a critique. So we want to deal a little bit with that issue because we disagree partly with Hania's view, and we want to just engage that question. But while we were planning this, we had somebody walk past our door, and we've convinced him to join us today. Dr. Cathal Doyle. Those of you who are not familiar with his work are about to be, because the next MOOC, the next chapter you do, is on free, prior, informed consent. And what we wanted to do, Cathal, is to just reflect a little bit with our students and among ourselves on social exclusion from the particular perspective of Indigenous peoples. So we'll come to you in a bit if you don't mind, but we just need to talk first a little bit about the reproductive rights. Now, it has been a controversial discussion at the United Nations, to say the least, partly because there's so many different cultural elements to what you can do in that particular space and how much states are willing to engage with. Partly, I think, also because there's been an exclusion, and the kinds of people who've talked about these issues are not normally or not often the kinds of people who are often put upon in these circumstances. And maybe we'll hear a little bit from you on that, Sarah. But I think the reproductive rights element as well, some of the discussion that I picked up from the planning process was a little bit of, the biggest issue we face is population growth. And if we fix population growth, then development will flow automatically. Yes, population has been growing, but for me, I was uncomfortable with that, because it seems to suggest that the only reason we are not getting to where we want to get to is because all these African women keep having more babies. Yes, population in some parts of the world are growing. Very often, population is growing in parts of the world that are deeply rooted in poverty, so it is an issue and needs to be dealt with. But to look at that as a single factor, when we don't look at consumption patterns and look at the fact that children in the developed world, the Western world, consume hundreds of times what many others consume. So to lock it into that zero-sum game, I felt very uncomfortable about it at the time. But you also can reflect a little bit more about how the whole reproductive rights agenda is being dealt with in general.
I think this whole thing about seeing the problem as being fertility and overpopulation, I mean, the idea has been around for a long time, and I personally thought we'd move forward from that, and that we were looking at a more balanced view, like you said, around consumption and production and the Western role within that. But it seems that it is quite something that people are still going back to. And the problem I have with it is the idea that if fertility is the problem, even if we accept that, then I'm not convinced that family planning is the solution per se, because what we've got to look at is not providing the services, but the rights of women to make the decisions over those services. So I think we've got two discourses going on there. One, which is around fertility is the problem and disputing that overpopulation is the problem, that fertility is the problem, which is making women the problem and particular groups of women the problem. And then the discourse around what do we do with that, just providing services is the answer, when in reality what we need to look at is the rights of people to make those decisions. And we know rights has been huge when we've been looking at fertility and fertility issues, because when we cast our minds back, certain groups of people were not given the right to decide. We had forced sterilizations, and still when we're looking at family planning, people, if they don't have the education, they don't have the information, they can't make that informed consent. They cannot say yes from a basis of knowledge. So that's why, for me, when we look at reproductive health, it has to be reproductive rights. And that's before we even get to the sexual rights, which are, of course, contested area as rights. But even going on that reproductive line, it has to be about rights, because it has to be about people making those decisions for themselves, all peoples being able to make those decisions for themselves, and we're into that issue of consent.
And also the culture element, I guess, the extent to which culture dictates whether or not you have consent. It dictates the margin within which you can exercise that consent. And I think that plays a massive role. But I mean, Cathal, you of course, you're one of the world's experts on the issue of free, prior, informed consent. I know it's in a very different context. The context that you look at is into the extent to which Indigenous peoples as groups have access to full information on the basis of which they can freely make decisions about usually development projects that take place in their realm. How would you weigh into this notion of consent and reproductive rights? Do you have a view on how you perceive it?
Yeah, I suppose there is a very clear link in the context of Indigenous peoples, because in a number of countries, as recent as the 1980s in Peru, there were programs of forced sterilization of Indigenous women, and obviously highly problematic for the reasons that you've mentioned, and also just in terms of culturally, this intrusion into the peoples as a collective determination of their own future and the existence of those peoples. So it's an issue that resonates very much when you talk about free-form consent in the bigger picture of development. Indigenous peoples also have that experience, that traumatic experience of sterilization programs in different parts of the world. So they're actually interlinked, even though the concept and how it is operationalized and how it's put into effect is very different in those contexts. So you mentioned that we're talking about social inclusion in general. And I suppose the first thing that comes to mind when you think of social inclusion and Indigenous peoples is that Indigenous peoples are almost identified by the fact that they're excluded, that they have been historically excluded. So if anybody's familiar with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in its preamble, one of the things that's very much stressed is the fact that Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the process of development and the determination of the type of development that they want. And this is where the notion of free, prior, and informed consent as a collective decision-making comes in, because it's essentially the other side of the right to determine your own development. Because if somebody else is determining development for you, if you don't have the right to decide what happens, to say, yes, I want that, or no, I don't want that, it's also saying that you don't have the right to determine your own development, because somebody else will do that for you, essentially. So that's sort of the background, or the one of the important bases for this requirement to obtain consent of peoples in relation to development.
Because I find it interesting, because when we talk about women's rights, then we're very much coming down to individual rights. Although we're talking about a collective, then we are talking individual. And then, of course, when you're talking Indigenous peoples, it's very much around collective rights. And of course, that individual collective rights tension is always very interesting.
I describe it to students as the Sandra Lovelace question, referring, of course, to a case that those of you who may have studied international human rights law will know about. And Sandra Lovelace was an Indian woman. I use the word Indian in inverted commas, of course, because that was the term to describe Native Canadians in that context. And she lived on a reservation, married a non-Indigenous Canadian, moved to Toronto, I think it was, decided to return to live on the reservation, at which point the elders said, I'm sorry, you're no longer Native Canadian, you're no longer Indian, you can't return. And it was that discussion of, you want to, on the one hand, give the Indigenous community the right to determine what happens in their specific area. At the same time, you want to ensure that individuals have the right to opt out and opt in. So you had a classic case by which a progressive idea of collective rights was in fact violating the individual right of the woman. And I think this is a tension we see quite often in terms of social inclusion in general. But Cathal, in terms of Indigenous peoples, one of the hardest things that the UN has had to deal with is, of course, this idea of treating Indigenous peoples as, the way I put it, objects rather than subjects of law. That essentially Indigenous peoples haven't played enough of a role in constructing the systems that we have because they have been excluded. Systems have then been constructed upon their lands, which then haven't given them rights. And now we are hoping that these systems, which they had no involvement in constructing, somehow give them the rights that they had in the first place. How do you deal with that tension in the world of international human rights law and Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so you touch on maybe two issues there. One is in the local context, or the experience of encroachment into Indigenous governance institutions, and how peoples today are addressing that, because you will find in jurisdictions throughout the world that you have maybe some form of state imposed structure. So you in the United States, very clear examples of tribal governments, and then you might have some traditional governance bodies. and these maybe haven't worked together historically. There's been tensions. I think what you're seeing today is the empowerment of communities and peoples to actually take over control of both sets of institutions and try to bring them together. So I think there's a greater emphasis on that with the passing of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with an increasing awareness of the rights of peoples to self-governance. This is, at least in theory, and in some cases it's happening, but because in many parts of the world, of course, governments still don't recognize Indigenous peoples. And that's one of the big triggers then to look towards the international system and to try and have more influence within the United Nations in particular, but also within regional systems. But if we look at the United Nations at the moment, there's a very interesting process of Indigenous peoples seeking greater participation as peoples or nations within the system of the United Nations, which fundamental principle is the right to self-determination of all peoples and the participation of all peoples. So there's an ongoing process looking at the potential for Indigenous peoples to have some form of participation in the General Assembly, which would be a first and it's a very interesting process, challenging process. You have peoples from different regions of the world who maybe have different capacity to do that, different recognition by their governments. And what is very important in the context of Indigenous peoples is that the peoples identify themselves as the people, that it's not the state that's saying you are an Indigenous people. And therefore this can become challenging in the context of some form of participation within an intergovernmental body or
even the United Nations General Assembly.
Exactly, like the United Nations General Assembly.
So what you mean is there'd be a representative of Indigenous peoples in the General Assembly, because that's then you start unpacking that and thinking,
which ones?
Yeah, how,
yes, exactly.
How?
So it's
how
very it's been a few years of consultations and there isn't any answer yet.
But let's also remember that there is a permanent forum on Indigenous issues, which didn't exist before. So you have a quite elevated body already. So can you just say a little bit about that for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. So yes, there's a number of mechanisms within the United Nations, and Indigenous peoples have been very successful in moving from a situation where they couldn't get in the door to actually having permanent, it's called a permanent forum. So it's a forum that meets once a year in New York and it reports to the Economic and Social Council. It's got 12 members, 6 are chosen by Indigenous people, 6 are chosen by governments. They're all Indigenous or Indigenous representatives. And they discuss a range of issues that cover basically the mandate of the Economic and Social Council. And then their role is to give guidance to the UN entities, so special agencies, funds, etc. And that's a very important body that has a very useful mandate within the United Nations. And you also have another body that then it's called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this body meets in Geneva, so the human rights within the human rights arena, and provides advice to states who are members of the Human Rights Council in relation to the implementation of the Declaration.
But this proposal now that Carl's talking about, of course, is to get representation directly at the General Assembly.
Yes,
and that's where Sarah's question is intriguing. So how would you configure that? What are the proposals on how to configure that?
I think the proposals are different depending on which group you're talking to. So groups like the groups like the Sami, who have their own parliament already, they would see themselves as having a seat should have a seat at the table. They are recognized, for example, within the ILO. Norway recognizes the Sami's right to participate as part of it as a governmental body. So there are models there. There's potential to do that as maybe observers. That's one idea. But how that would be configured, who would be chosen, the numbers, that's extremely challenging, and I certainly don't have the answer to that. I think that's something that the Indigenous peoples, collectively have to work out in dialogue with states, and obviously the states have the decision-making power at the moment.
But there is precedence around this, because the UN General Assembly has had something in the past called observer status. Some that you may be from the ANC, the African National Congress, that had observer status in the context of apartheid South Africa, SWAPO, the Namibian independence movement, but also the Red Cross, the Order of St. John's of Malta. So there are various different groups that have had this kind of consultative status before, but they've often been a kind of single entity representative. How you can get multiples to be representative is going to be a new departure, I think, for
definition, they're very
UN politics.
Yes.
Different peoples.
Yes.
They just have this one collective identity, which is Indigenous, but of course there's so many differences between them in terms of culture and country, and
hugely different. Yes, in terms of the capacity to organize themselves, to recognize as having governments, and some countries will refuse to recognize even the label as applicable to them. So yeah, how you come up with a solution within that reality, I don't know. I definitely don't have the answer to that.
But we also discussed in class the other day, because Cathal and I co-teach a class here at Middlesex on minorities and Indigenous peoples, and we also discussed the difficulty of, if Indigenous peoples do manage somehow to configure a right at the General Assembly, of course the next step becomes states then start denying which Indigenous peoples are Indigenous peoples, because that will be the weapon that comes back. So if all of a sudden a strong lobby emerges to put a Native American nation into the General Assembly, next thing is the US government will be saying, oh, but we don't recognize them as Indigenous anymore. And then you have that zero-sum game again with it.
So that's the risk. Precisely. That's the challenge there, of not losing what you've already gained within the United Nations system, this principle of self-identification and being able to participate, engage with states, and not to take a step backward where the states start to say, you yes, you no, and that's a very dangerous game.
If we can just think of social exclusion in slightly broader terms than UN participation. So you've had experience now from what I remember of detailed experiences you've had, Philippines, Peru, Colombia, even Russia, various different parts of the world. Are there models that emerge from the work that you've done that are somehow better as models? That are there particular, if you're saying to our students who are looking at this issue, you want to see good social inclusion policies, why not go and look at X or Y? Which ones would you recommend
which ones would you not recommend?
It's
probably easier.
But we always think about bad examples.
If you think about bad, maybe we can move towards the good.
There we go. That's the social scientist, the critical social scientist against the establishment law. So he's always doing this to me, making me look like
a bit of both. If I can try a bit of both. It's definitely easier to think of the bad cases, just because there's so many of them. But there's a case in Peru, very interesting case, where, first, maybe to take a step back, I think if we think about social inclusion in the context of Indigenous peoples, it has to be on Indigenous peoples' terms. So that's historically, even the notion of free, prior, informed consent existed at the early days of international law. This notion existed. If anybody looks at Victoria's writings, he talked about free and voluntary choice.
Can I interrupt you there and tell our students that Cathal's book, looking at free, prior, informed consent, tracks a little bit of the history, and it's definitely worth looking at. Routledge, 2015. Yeah, go on.
So anyway, basically the principle of inclusion and consent was there in theory, but it was the terms of the colonizer, right, which effectively meant that European states determined the rules, and they weren't compatible with the cultures and the realities of the people. So if we're talking about good practices of inclusion of Indigenous peoples today, I think the starting point are the Indigenous peoples setting the rules and the agenda. And a good case in very early days so far is a people called the Wampi people in northern Peru, the Amazon Peru, and they have established their own government, and they've come up with their own constitution, and they've presented this to the Peruvian state, and they want recognition of the state. They have different budgets in different areas. It's very, very, very well structured, but all developed internally, all developed in accordance with their own customs and practices. And it's a fascinating example that doesn't get an awful lot of attention, because the cases that get attention are when something goes really wrong, right? When somebody is killed, when there's massive protests. It's only at the point where people are at breaking point, really, where you get attention to their issues. But that case, I think, shows the potential of Indigenous peoples, if they're given the opportunity to actually proactively develop their structures and strengthen their structures. They have these structures, but they've been weakened over time. And if they can control their territory, there's a lot of potential there. The issue then is getting the state to actually recognize that and not to be afraid of the notion of Indigenous government. State here is government and sort of
sees a
threat to sovereignty, threat to resources. So it's a gradual process, and what happens sometimes is the state doesn't respond officially, but maybe some entities of the state start to work with the government, and it's a de facto sort of recognition until you get to the point maybe where there's resources that are in that area that.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, because that's always the sticking point, isn't it? It's fine if there's nothing there that the central government wants, but if there's something there that central government wants, then surely that creates that. Because I've done some work around gender in the extractive industries, and so we know that the minute that there could be some valuable resources, then
it's collared.
Tensions become heightened.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you have the bad cases most of the time, even when you've got very good law, like in the Philippines. Joshua mentioned the Philippines. They have a law enacted in 1997, which was a model of the then Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it recognizes self-determination, right to development, right to free, prior, informed consent. There's a government institution established specifically to oversee and facilitate the implementation of the law. But what you see consistently is that whenever there's a resource, and very frequently there are resources in Indigenous lands, because they're the remote areas that have the last untouched resources are often in these areas. The consistent thing is that the state body will guide the process such that the outcome is that the resources can be accessed, irrespective most of the time of the people's actual wishes. So even though the law says one thing, the reality is quite removed.
You touch on a raw nerve here, because we have the standard law versus non-law. But actually, Sarah, this is one of those examples that proves your point. So the 1997 Indigenous Peoples law in the Philippines was 10 years ahead of the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, which was only passed in 2007. So you have an institution here that almost shows you how good strong law can be in 1997, but then the implementation. Here we are, and it's interesting because it was 1997, 2007 was when the Declaration was passed, and here we are at the end of 2017. And it's 20 years of that Indigenous Peoples law in Philippines, and it's had minimal effect.
It's had some effect, but yes, and you look at particular cases, oftentimes the effect is minimal. I suppose what's interesting sometimes is when you think about Indigenous peoples, you have to think in the time window that the problem has been in existence for. So 500 years of oppression and marginalization. Maybe we're expecting too much, that in 10, 20 years, even with the law, that we will have,
Are we expecting too much if we believe in the inherent dignity and worth of every individual here and now? I mean, are we?
Here and now.
Here and now.
Here and now.
I mean, I believe that that's exactly what should be the case. But in order to change institutions that have worked in a way over time, you effectively, if you look, that's one of the issues. You look at the institution that's responsible for enforcing this law. That same institution was responsible for enforcing previous regimes, previous laws, and the mindset, to change the mindset to resources are always a big challenge in these contexts. The funding of these institutions is always the first thing to go whenever there's a cut. So it absolutely it's not acceptable for the state to say this is going to take decades.
Progressive realization.
It's not a progressive realization issue, because what is at stake sometimes is the survival of a people, and that's one of the most fundamental issues, I guess, in human rights tries to address, that all people should be able to develop and flourish and have their own means of subsistence.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, essentially, that was just a little bit of a taster. Hopefully, it's made you want to go and look up Cathal's next chapter, and also to look up the book, which I think is, I was privileged enough to watch it come into fruition, and the historical richness, I think, of the argument, because you can't really deal with Indigenous peoples' issues without understanding the history of it, because you're trying to recorrect something that, and again, law was an instrument of dispossession. So to then try to think about law as an instrument of repossession is quite something, when the institutions haven't changed, and this is the theme we keep returning to. If you're going to use law as a tool for any kind of emancipation, empowerment, whatever it is you want to call it, how that law is configured and who are the people configuring it becomes so important. And of course, in the context of gender, as we have been discussing, women have been further away from those sites of power, and Indigenous peoples, you have an even further dramatic remove. And women who are Indigenous, that's an almost invisible category altogether. So anyway, we hope we've given you some insights into it. Of course, we started this conversation off with reproductive rights. I trust that you've enjoyed Hania's video. I do want to stress that the position we would take would be different in terms of family planning and reproductive rights. But again, we want to use this as a forum to hear from other people. We want to stimulate that discussion, which the SDG agenda didn't get enough attention.
No, it was very much.
And so anything that focuses in it is useful to have, because that discussion remains pending and in abeyance as far as we're concerned. But then also we wanted to talk a little bit about social exclusion, mirroring the theme that you're following in the MOOC, and of course the theme that's about to be unleashed on you by Dr. Cathal Doyle. So hope you enjoyed that. Those of you who are watching it this side of the end of the new year, trust that 2018 will be a year full of the processes that we need to put this world on the right axis. Let's draw a line under 2017.
Yes.
And let's hope a big line under 2017.
Move forward.
Let's start reconfiguring history. We need your involvement to do it. We have to do it jointly and collaboratively and in a way that's inclusive. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you in 2018. Thank you, Rebecca, and good luck to you. We still haven't managed to persuade her. No, we were joking earlier about the fact that even random people passing across the corridor were brought in to Dr. Doyle, the random person walking across. But we still haven't managed to persuade Rebecca. If any of you have any ideas on what it could take to bring Rebecca front of camera, we would appreciate suggestions. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca.
And thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Cathal.